Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Rebecca Lammers. I am the chair of the Democrats Abroad Taxation Task Force, and I lead on our tax advocacy work to pass residency-based taxation. I'm originally from Ohio, and I live in London. So it's my pleasure to be presenting this webinar, which is a discussion on HR 1046-8, the Residence-Based Taxation for Americans Abroad Act. So before we get started, I need to read this disclaimer. So Democrats abroad cannot provide individual tax advice. Advice requires consideration of your individual circumstances and needs, none of which can be done at this event. We are not tax lawyers, accountants, or advisors. Please consult a professional tax advisor, accountant, return preparer when addressing your personal tax matters. Democrats abroad does not endorse or recommend companies or individuals attending or hosting this event. If you are in need of tax advice, you can consult the IRS Tax Return Preparer directory to find an advisor or tax return preparer near you, or providing online services to meet your needs and budget. Democrats Abroad accepts no liability for any actions taken or not taken by participants in this event as a result of information obtained at this event or from a participant choosing a preparer from the IRS directory or based on something someone said or did at this event. Great. So now that we have the formality out of the way, this is the agenda. We've now finished introductions and housekeeping. We're now going to go into the main presentation, followed by a quick public service announcement about Democrats Abroad, and then we will conclude with the open Q&A session. So with that, we'll get straight into it. So I'm going to talk about how the bill came about first before I go into more detail about the contents of the bill and what the change in law could be. So, some background information on Wednesday last week, a bill called the Residence-Based Taxation for Americans Abroad Act was introduced in the House of Representatives by Congressman Darren LaHood, who is a Republican from Illinois. The reason that this bill was introduced was many years in the making, but most recently was due to the combined advocacy efforts of Democrats Abroad, Tax Fairness for Americans Abroad, and most of the American Abroad organizations. Just to take a step back here, the current congressional session, the 118th Congress, ended this past Friday. And the bill, as it was introduced last week, as well as all bills that were introduced in the 118th Congress have now died. So just trying to kind of clarify the procedure. Essentially, this bill is now dead because Congress is now ended. So why would a member of Congress introduce a bill right at the end of the Congress knowing that the bill would die? This is actually a common tactic that many members of Congress use. So this actually isn't unusual behavior. There are many reasons for it. And sometimes members of Congress are retiring and they decide to introduce a bill before they retire to make a statement of support for a specific policy. Another example, members introduce a bill at the end of the Congress with the intention of putting it on the record to then reintroduce in the next Congress. And that is the case with this particular bill. The idea is that this is actually a draft bill and it's being introduced to the public so that they get feedback in order to improve the bill for reintroduction next year. And so congressional staff are looking for feedback on how to improve the residence-based tax procedure for Americans abroad, and also to improve the policy to eliminate tax loopholes. And I'm going to go into more detail later on how to submit your own personal feedback as well. So I think it's really important to emphasize here, and I do not think I can emphasize this enough, that everything I'm going to be talking about in terms of the bill's content is subject to change as it may be reintroduced next year in the 119th Congress and as it subsequently moves through the legislative process. So I want to be really, really clear about that this all is subject to change. And so I want to be upfront about that right now. Um, and we're also in ongoing conversations with Democratic members of Congress to try to make the bill bipartisan. So I hope that kind of sets the scene in terms of what is going on with the bill. So going into the contents of the bill, again, can't emphasize enough, this is all subject to change, and it is also really high level. But on the whole, what this bill does is it creates an optional procedure, keyword here is optional, to allow Americans abroad to be treated the same way as a non-US citizen who lives outside of the United States, and how they are treated for tax purposes. In the tax world, someone who is not a tax resident in the United States and is not a US citizen is referred to as a non-resident alien, or NRA for short. NRAs pay US taxes only on their US sourced income. There are very specific criteria for how an American abroad could be eligible, which I'll go into here in a little bit. And there are a number of provisions that would prevent someone from using this procedure to evade taxes as well. The overall goal is to create an optional procedure. Again, keyword here is optional, to address the main pain points Americans abroad experience regarding tax and financial access problems. If you were to elect to do this procedure, you would be terminating your US tax residency and be treated the same as a non-resident alien, but you would keep your US citizenship. Under the current US tax system, which is a citizenship-based tax system, we are all taxed by the US on all of our income sources, regardless of where we live in the world, however long we lived abroad, and irrespective of whether we have even ever resided in the United States. And the only way to terminate US tax residency is to renounce your US citizenship. But this isn't ideal because not everybody wants to give up their US citizenship, right? Many people feel like they're having to choose between being able to maintain a normal financial life and keep their US citizenship. And no other nation in the world has this type of tax system where people are renouncing due to taxes. And so this bill is a potential new option that would address this problem. Keep in mind that high net worth individuals would be subject to a departure tax on assets with unrealized gains, and anyone that would elect to complete this procedure would receive a certificate of non-residency, which would be a piece of paper that they would provide, that would say that you are no longer a US tax resident. So in theory, you would be able to walk into your local bank in the country that you live in, show them the certificate, say that you are no longer a US tax resident, and then they would, in theory, be able to take you on as a customer. At least that is the intention. If you were ever to return to live in the United States, you would resume US tax residency and be taxed as any other US resident would be on their worldwide income. So those who choose to complete the procedure, as a result, would be exempt from FBAR and FATCA reporting. I'm going to assume that a lot of you know what the FBAR and FATCA reporting is. However, I'm happy to go into more detail about that during the Q&A if that's not clear. But a non-discrimination provision that is in the bill is intentionally trying to encourage banks to accept US citizens with that certificate of non-residency for US tax purposes. You would only be liable for filing and paying US tax on US sourced income, like dividends. If you completed the procedure and you did owe US tax on US sourced income, then you would have to file a Form 1040-NR return, which is for non-residents of the United States, which is simpler than a regular 1040 and would only be necessary in situations where tax has not been automatically withheld from the income. For example, you own an apartment in the US that you rent out. So having completed the procedure, the savings clause of the tax treaties would be waived. This is so just to clarify what the savings clause is, this is a standard provision that's in all the US tax treaties that basically says that the US reserves the right to tax its citizens however it wants without regard to any provisions in the treaty. And this is why US citizens living abroad have suffered from double taxation in certain cases. In order to make sure that no one can use this procedure to evade taxes, a number of anti-tax evasion provisions have been put in place to make it difficult for this procedure to be abused. These include a departure tax on high net worth individuals, which is indexed to the current inheritance tax rate of $13.61 million. But this is likely to come down in the next version of the bill, and Democrats will also likely want to see it come down as well. So again, a provision that is subject to change. You must certify that you are tax compliant, which means you need to be up to date with your US tax returns for the last 5 years. All US sourced income will still be subject to US tax and withholding. FATCA remains in place if you do not elect to complete this procedure, and you absolutely must establish and maintain residency in another country to qualify for the procedure, which means that digital nomads aren't eligible for this since they don't have tax residency in another country. And there's also a clawback for those who reestablish residency in the US in less than 4 years from the time that you do the election. So you can't flip-flop back and forth between being a US tax resident and being a non-resident. So, okay, I've talked about what would change or could change. What doesn't change? So, the first thing is that your US citizenship wouldn't change. You would still be a US citizen. You would still retain all the voting rights that you have today to vote from abroad. You would retain your right to unrestricted travel to visit and live in the United States. And finally, you'd continue to have the right to pass on citizenship to your children. So none of those things are changing. So what kind of person might benefit from this procedure? These are some examples of the types of people that might benefit, and I want to reiterate here that it is up to each individual to determine if this procedure would be something that you might want to do if it were to pass. The types of people that would benefit potentially include those who have limited financial ties to the US. So they don't have significant US sourced income like rental property or a US based business, someone that was born abroad and has never lived in the United States, like those who may identify as an accidental American, and those who plan to continue living outside of the US for an extended period of time might benefit from this. So conversely, it might be helpful to clarify what kind of person might not benefit from this procedure. So someone that might not benefit would be someone that is living abroad on a short-term basis, like someone that goes abroad on a 2-year work assignment and then they plan to go back to live in the US. Someone who has significant US sourced income where a local credit would sorry, who has US sourced income where a local credit would not offset US taxes. For example, someone living in a country with a low dividend tax, someone who may benefit from a preferential tax treaty between their country of residence and the US, such as retirees in France who have most of their retirement income in the US, And those who do not have tax residency established in another country, such as a digital nomad, which I mentioned earlier, who wouldn't qualify for this procedure anyway. Um, there are some special cases, though. Certain individuals, if the bill were to pass, as it currently stands, would be automatically deemed a non-resident if they meet the following criteria. So current Americans abroad who have lived overseas for at least 3 of the last 5 years and can certify tax compliance, so they've filed a tax return for the period of time, are exempt from the departure tax regardless of their wealth level. Those who have continuously resided abroad since the age of 25 or since the enactment of FATCA in 2010 would be exempt from the departure tax regardless of wealth level and past compliance status. U.S. citizen babies born abroad in the future would be born as non-residents and would be issued a certificate of non-residency at birth. And the specific procedures and applicability of the $100 fee for that certificate of non-residence would be clarified in future regulations. We don't have the specifics on that right now. So these are basically like grandfathering provisions, as it were, and are intended to recognize the problems Americans abroad have faced and suffered from in the past. So these specific provisions are in place for those who have potentially suffered the most, and trying to recognize that in the legislation. Okay, so I'm going to go through some of the most frequently asked questions that came our way. So first one, really simple and straightforward. Will I lose my right to vote? As previously mentioned earlier, just a few minutes ago, there is no change to voting in this bill. So your right to vote from abroad remains in place if you decide to do this procedure. Will I be able to save or invest in accounts in my country of residence? So in the bill, an individual who would make an RBT election would not be subject to any U.S. reporting or tax on their non-U.S. income. An individual who makes the election would be able to go to a local bank and show that certificate of non-residence to be eligible to open an account. So, for example, one can invest in a Canadian tax-free savings account or TFSA, or a UK individual savings account, an ISA right now. But you can put your money into those accounts. I think there's a lot of myths around that you can't, but you actually can. But it is currently subject to U.S. tax, whereas it is tax-free in those countries if you're a resident of those countries. Under this procedure, if you were to elect RBT, you would no longer be subject to U.S. tax and information reporting on these non-U.S. savings or investments. Okay, next one. Would I be subject to U.S. capital gains on the sale of my non-U.S. home? So under the bill, an individual who makes an RBT election would not have to file a 1040 and therefore would not be subject to U.S. capital gains on the sale of their non-U.S. home. Hope that's straightforward. Also, how does the bill impact foreign domiciled investments that fall under U.S. PFIC reporting? So to clarify, this is the passive foreign investment company reporting that a lot of non-U.S. investments are subject to on the tax return, on the U.S. tax return. So under the bill, an individual who might make the RBT election would not have to file a 1040 and therefore would not be subject to the PFIC reporting or tax. In the same vein, will I still have to pay tax on US-based income, including investments made in the US like stocks or shares? So again, this is all in theory because none of it's real yet, but in theory, you would be taxed in the same way that a non-resident alien is currently taxed on US-based stocks. So the way this usually works is capital gains are taxed by your country of residence. Dividends are different. So dividends are taxed so that first the tax is withheld by the US and then taxed by your country of residence. The withheld US tax is then credited against your local tax. And this is somewhat opposite to what we have now, where local tax in your country of residence is paid first. So yeah, there's that one. Another frequently asked question was, how does this bill impact Social Security payments? Again, taxpayers who might elect RBT would be taxed on as non-resident aliens, benefiting from any applicable provisions of the tax treaty between the US and their country of residence. So it would basically be based off of the tax treaty for where you live. Okay, so we will be taking more questions here live, but those were the most frequently asked questions, and I hope that helps clarify where things are at as it currently stands. There have been a lot of myths floating around and rumors about this bill and what it does or doesn't do. So I wanted to bust some of those myths about what the bill is not. So the bill does not exempt individuals from US tax on US sourced income. Americans abroad will still owe US tax on US sourced income. And this aligns the US tax code with the rest of the world by creating a residency-based taxation option, keyword optional, for Americans abroad. The bill does not create a tax giveaway to the rich. There are tight, what are referred to as guardrails on the bill to prevent tax loopholes. Inside the US and within Congress, lawmakers are rightfully concerned about people leaving the country to evade taxes, which does happen. But what this does is that it makes changes in residency an unattractive way to avoid taxes. And I'll talk a little bit more later about getting your feedback because we'd love to hear your feedback on making sure that this isn't being abused in order to evade taxes. This bill is not the result of Trump's pledge to end double taxation for Americans abroad. The policy development for this bill has been in the works for a number of years and builds on years of research. There is no way that anyone would have been able to develop a policy of this detail in only 2 months. And some of you may remember that we hosted a webinar to talk about elective RBT back in February. So this is something that's been under development for a long time. This bill is not the RBT bill that was introduced back in 2018. This is a brand new and totally different residency-based tax bill. And then finally, the bill does not change the estate tax. The worldwide estate of electing individuals would continue to be taxable, subject to an exclusion amount of $13.61 million. So state taxes don't change, tax treaties don't change, though all of those things remain in place. Okay, so what the bill does do, it helps the majority low and middle income Americans abroad to not have to pay high tax prep costs to prove they owe no US tax when they're already paying a higher tax in their country of residence. I continue to cite the government's own statistics back at them. So in 2021, 62% of tax returns filed from abroad owed no US tax. Most people who file from abroad don't owe any US tax. The only people benefiting from the current system is the tax prep lobby. And then the bill does help Americans abroad save for the future. The intention here is to help enable Americans abroad to be able to open a bank account, retirement account, investment account, whatever it is in their country of residence. Okay, so lastly, you should spend time to decide if this is a procedure that you would want to do yourself and if this is something that you'd like to see become law. So some things you can do include looking at what taxes look like for non-resident aliens right now. That'll give you a pretty good idea of how this non-residency election might look like. Read up on the concept of income sourcing to better understand what US taxes your non-US citizen friends and colleagues might pay. If the bill actually does pass, I cannot emphasize enough that you would need to seek qualified professional advice on what is right for your unique situation. Because as we discussed earlier, this is not necessarily an option that will benefit everyone. And I strongly recommend that you read the resources we have put together on the Democrats Abroad website by going to www.democratsabroad.org/RBT_bill. Right. So next steps. When is the bill going to pass? This is like another top question. But I need to emphasize here that I don't have a crystal ball. I can't see into the future. But here are some factors to consider when it comes to trying to pass this specific bill. First, it will have to be reintroduced in the 119th Congress next year. That's the first step. Secondly, factors that will help increase its chance of passing include getting bipartisan support. As I said earlier, DA is seeking a Democratic co-sponsor for the bill, and then the more co-sponsors the bill has, that helps increase its chances of passing. So, in order to help make that happen, the more constituents that contact their members of Congress to co-sponsor the bill and raise awareness of the issue, the better. We need a tsunami wave of Americans abroad contacting their members of Congress about this bill. Some of you may be aware that the windfall elimination provision repeal bill recently passed. It just passed on Friday, and that was a result of decades of grassroots advocacy with hundreds of thousands of people contacting all members of Congress about it. Our numbers as Americans abroad are the equivalent of one state, and our voices are spread out based on where we last lived. We're represented as constituents based on the last state that we lived in before we moved abroad. And so we face an uphill battle to be heard. But it's not impossible because, as we saw with the windfall elimination provision repeal bill last week, change is possible. Strategically, we have a big advantage coming up in 2025. I think it's important to also clarify that this Congress, this past Congress, the one for the last 2 years, was one of the most ineffective Congresses in history, with very few bills passing due to all of the drama that you've probably seen in the news. This coming Congress is not going to be any different. But that said, Congress has to pass a tax bill next year. There are a number of tax provisions that are expiring, and so one big tax bill is going to pass next year. Most bills are not passed on their own. They often get attached to a bigger bill as a strategy of passage. And so this is the bigger bill opportunity that we want to take advantage of. So what are the chances of this actually happening? Honestly, the chances are pretty slim, if I'm honest, but as I said, it is not impossible. So I'm going to explain in more detail here shortly how you can get involved to help increase the chances to make this become a reality. Here are the top 5 things that you can do right now to help. First, give your personal feedback on the bill. I think Mary's going to put the link in the chat box, but we can't make the bill better if we don't know if this is something that you want. And it only takes a few minutes of your time. And the link will also be emailed to you along with the recording after we finish, so you can fill it out later. Secondly, we need you to write and call and message on social media your members of Congress to raise awareness that this bill exists and to ask that they co-sponsor the bill when it is reintroduced next Congress. If you don't know how to contact your members of Congress, a link should now be put into the chat box with instructions that go into detail about how to find your members of Congress and our tips for getting through. Third, you can volunteer for the Democrats Abroad Taxation Task Force to help make RBT happen. You can also donate to the Democrats Abroad Taxation Task Force to help fund our efforts. And finally, you can sign up with the Taxation Task Force mailing list to stay in the loop. We don't email you that much, and we only email when we need your help to take a small action that will have a large impact on our tax advocacy work. Additionally, we put together resources on the website that you can read on the Democrats Abroad website, including an explainer on the bill, and it only takes a few minutes to read that helps you better understand what's in the bill itself, as well as an FAQ. We have many, many resources available to help you understand the bill and uh, next steps, so please go to the website to check out more. Okay, so I think we're ready. Hold on, let me turn on the Q&A. Uh, all right, so you guys should now have the Q&A box and you should be able to submit questions. So go for it. Um, in the meantime, I'm gonna just give you a quick public service announcement about Democrats Abroad Taxation Task Force and our work. So as we've talked about already, we advocate for a switch to residency-based taxation, relief from FATCA, an exemption for American abroad business owners from the GILTI and the transition tax. And you can read more about us on our website. What do we do in general? So we're a group of volunteers all over the world, and we are advocating for tax reform for Americans abroad. So we wrote a tax and financial access report on Americans abroad. We conduct regular research. We help host tax and financial education events all over the world. We submit statements for the record for congressional hearings. We also do candidate outreach and education, as well as visit Washington, D.C. to talk to tax writers in Congress and the IRS and Treasury. So these are all work that we do on an ongoing basis. I would really recommend that you read our latest report. A lot of people that I hear from say that it has helped them feel more educated and also less alone, knowing that lots of other people have suffered the same issues that they have. Just a reminder that a lot of our webinars that we hosted from earlier in the year are going to expire on December 31st. So if there are any kind of topics that we touched on that you would like more information on in terms of the current system, these webinars are available for a small donation. Uh, Also, just a reminder to register to vote from abroad for next year. You can set a reminder on January 1st. I know that next year isn't a big election year, but there are going to be special elections and also state level elections that are really big. So do set a reminder and register because your vote from abroad does matter. These are 7 small actions that you can help in general, but I think I've given you guys a lot already, but you're going to get the slides after anyway. And just another reminder before we go into the Q&A, just please fill in the feedback form. Is really important before we end today. Okay, so I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen so that I can actually see, and we're going to go to the Q&A and let's see. So yeah, don't forget to upvote on the or like the questions so that we can go through the questions that are the most liked. So don't forget that. And I see a few hands up, but we're not going to be taking any questions that way. We're only going to be answering questions that have been submitted through the Q&A box. So please do submit your questions, and also go through and like the ones that you want to hear answers to first, because we're going to go through that, and we'll only do that from until we run out of time here. So let's see. The first question here is HR 5432, the Tax Simplification for Americans Abroad Act, introduced in 2023, stalled in the Ways and Means Committee. Given this history, what specific changes in the political landscape, advocacy efforts, or legislative strategy make us confident that this new bill has a better chance of advancing if reintroduced? Sorry, it just disappeared. And then there was a follow-up question, how specifically does this bill differ from the 2018 bill? I think there's some confusion here. So HR 5432, Tax Simplification for Americans Abroad Act, which was introduced by Congressman Don Beyer, who is a Democrat, it has been introduced to the last two Congresses. So basically, that particular bill is a different bill where it would create like a 1040EZ form for Americans abroad to make it easier and simpler to file. It does not get rid of filing. It also has the provision in it to eliminate some of the like unfair taxation on some of the most vulnerable Americans abroad, such as on benefits, non-US benefits, disability payments, scholarships, things of that nature. And it would also combine the FATCA and the FBAR forms into one form and attach it to the 1040. So that is a different bill that is seeking to provide solutions in a different way, which Democrats abroad is supportive of that bill as well. I think something, again, just want to take a step back. Something to keep in mind here is that there are different strategies to go after fixing the same problem. So that's one way to go after fixing the problem. This bill that this webinar is about for the tax residence-based tax for Americans abroad bill, that's a different way to go after fixing the problem. And then the follow-up question was how specifically does this bill differ from the 2018 bill? It differs significantly in that it is not a full-on overhaul of the tax system. It is specifically creating an option, again, option for Americans abroad. And it is an optional procedure. People do not have to do it. It's just an option. Um, so I hope that that helps. Okay, so the next top's question, could assets currently held in the US, for example, stocks, bonds, ETFs, cash, be moved out of the US to make income non-US sourced? Um, and then I saw a follow-up answer of yes, but dividends of US-based companies are always US taxable first. Um, I think I'm going to ask Nick Lee, who's on standby. I don't know, Nick, if you have an answer on that, but or should we defer and check that later?
Yeah. So in principle, you could definitely change what you're invested in, and that would affect the sourcing. But at the end of the day, as Arif mentions, if it's a US based company, the income will always be US sourced, whether it's you that owns it directly or whether it's owned by a investment fund in the country that you live. So it would either be you that pays the taxes directly, or it would be the investment fund that you just bought into that also pays the taxes. Um, so if the company is a US company, at the end of the day, you're still going to owe the taxes, but you would have local investment options as well, which is an improvement over what we have now.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful question. Thank you for asking that. Uh, Okay, I'm gonna go to the next question, which is I have two IRAs sitting in the US. When it comes time to start drawdown, will that be considered US source income? Uh, Nick, do you know the answer to that one?
Yeah, so both traditional IRAs and Roth IRAs would typically be considered US sourced income. I believe a Roth IRA would be considered to be under the same rules as it is when you are a US resident, namely, if you meet the eligibility requirements, it's not taxed. There would be tax withholding on a traditional IRA typically, but there may be treaty relief available and you would get a local tax credit in many cases. Um,
Okay, thank you. I'm seeing a number of other questions about if US if Social Security is your only source of income, would you still have to file? And also how would it be taxed? I went over this during the FAQs. Um, so like it the way that it would be taxed depends on the tax treaty for your country. Um, just going back to that slide. And um, so again, this would come down to you having to figure out for your own personal situation if this something that would benefit you. But your first port of call will be to go and look at your country's tax treaty on that front. Um, will the bill change the law on non-citizen spouses having to pay tax on inheritance from their US citizen spouse? Oh, I don't know. Nick, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, so for better or for worse, this bill really does not touch the question of inheritance. This would be something where once this bill comes into reality, it would be best to ask a qualified tax advisor. Maybe there's options around joint accounts or joint asset ownership that wasn't there previously, but this is well beyond the realm of general advice.
Yeah. Again, this is all very like all this is subject to change, guys. Like I know that this is really exciting and we have never gotten this far, but I think it's one of those things where do consider that we're looking for your feedback on the bill right now. That is really, really important. But these are great questions. Keep them coming. And don't forget to keep going through and liking them because that helps us go through and answer questions as they're coming in here. Okay, so the next question is, how does electing RBT affect the ability to deposit into my IRA, whether it's a Roth or standard? Oh, Nick, I'm gonna throw that to you again.
Yeah, so my understanding is if you're not a US tax resident, it's not possible to contribute to an IRA or a Roth. So you'd be able to keep the accounts, you'd be able to keep the investments within the accounts, but you would not be able to add new money into the accounts. This is kind of like how if you don't have any taxable income for the year, that you cannot make any contributions.
Okay. Um, and then the next one was, I think I missed something you said. What is the definition of a high net worth individual with respect to the tax on unrealized gains? But I think some of the people that have commented have answered the question. Um, so the current inheritance tax rate is at 13.61 million. And some anonymous person has rightfully pointed out that it expires in 2025. Um, if nobody does anything, so again, you have to keep in mind that there are a number of tax provisions that expire next year, and they're looking at renewing, extending, etc. Um, if they it could be subject to change next year. The current departure tax as proposed in the bill is set at that rate, uh, but it could come down. So again, all of these things are subject to change. Um, the next question is, does this affect the windfall elimination provision of Social Security? So I think it's important to note that on Friday, the windfall elimination provision repeal bill was passed in the Senate. It has now passed through Congress. It now needs to go to President Biden's desk for signature, which he said that he will do before he ends his term. So this bill doesn't have anything to do with the windfall elimination provision on Social Security. They're two completely independent things that are going on. Next question is the $100 fee validity unlimited, or would one have to renew after X number of years? Um, my understanding is it's in order to get the certificate. Um, again, a lot of these kind of logistics of how things will be implemented have not been worked out. Um, so like if you lost the certificate, would you have to pay the $100 again to get it? I don't know. Like these are just things that have not been worked out as of yet. But yeah, I don't know. Nick, do you have anything to add on that front?
Yeah, I mean, the IRS does issue a lot of other certificates for other purposes. Like, actually, you can pay them $85 today to get a certificate saying you are a US tax resident. Um, and they very helpfully explain on the website it's $85 whenever you need to make a request. Um, so our assumption is if you don't lose your original copy, probably it would be $100, but everything is subject to change.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so the next question is, what is the difference between a departure tax versus an exit tax? I'm so sorry to cause any kind of confusion. It basically is the same thing. It's just two different ways of saying the same thing. Um, yeah, sorry for the confusion on that front. And then there was a follow-up question, or what happens when one decides to renounce after electing for RBT? Is renunciation exit tax still due? Oh, another one. I don't think, I don't know, Nick, do you have any
So
thoughts on that?
I I think this one actually is mentioned somewhere in the text of the bill, what happens to the expatriation tax, but I don't know exactly. I'm going to mark this as a follow-up that maybe we can answer later.
Okay, yeah, sorry, we'll come back on that one. Again, all of this is very fresh and new, so we're doing our best to try to answer your questions here. Okay, the next one is how would this potential law change one's obligations with respect to paying taxes as resident in the country where one lives? There are no changes to the tax laws in your country of residence, so there would be no change in that respect. Um, yeah, I don't know. Nick, do you have anything to add on that?
The only thing that would be worth highlighting again is if you have a very specific treaty position, and you would know if this is the case, that potentially your local taxes could change as a result of electing RBT. But again, this is not something that you stumble into. You know if you are making use of these treaty positions, and you know who you are.
Yeah. Um, is there any chance that estate taxes on foreign earned assets or for citizens who have been abroad for a long time will also be included? Uh, I don't follow. Do you understand what they're saying there, Nick?
I think the question is whether or not there would be any changes to the estate tax rules. I'm going to speculate and say probably not. It would make this bill even bigger and more complicated. Um,
They're not changing the estate taxes. So they're not changing, nothing changes with the treaties, nothing changes with the estate tax level. Um, I think it's hard for people to get their heads wrapped around like this would be a very specific optional procedure where you would get treated as a non-resident alien. So I think trying to switch to that mode is very difficult for people to get their heads wrapped around, which I'm honestly still trying to get my head wrapped around it as well. So you're not alone in that respect. But something that might benefit you is to look at how non-resident alien NRAs are currently taxed, because that is essentially the intention here is for people to be taxed only on their US sourced income and look at how they're being NRAs are taxed in that way. The next question is, what's the main reason for the slim chance assessment of RBT success on 2025? Um, I think you need to like, I mean, I'm probably one of the most like enthusiastic about this bill and like I'm one of those people where never say never, like, because lots of things can happen. Again, I don't have a crystal ball. I can't predict the future. It all very much depends on how many people from abroad write to their members of Congress. And keep in mind that you can write to your member of Congress every day. You can email them, you can call them, you can message them on social media. There's no limit to the number of times that you can contact your members of Congress. And the more that you do that, and the more people that do that, that will help increase its chances. So a lot of it has to do with the combination of all the American abroad organizations, um, and our advocacy efforts, as well as the grassroots advocacy efforts of you writing to your member of Congress. There are a lot of different factors that go into it. There's that piece, and then the other piece is that we're not the only people asking for something to go in this big tax package next year. You need to understand that there are literally hundreds of different activists, lobbyists, all advocating for all different kinds of tax provisions to be amended and changed and added and the whole nine yards. So, um, but from my experience, those who scream the loudest get heard, and it helps to get involved. As they say, democracy is not a spectator sport, so that's why we need more Americans abroad to be writing and contacting their members of Congress. So your help will help us help you help us that kind of scenario. Um, okay, and then I think we have a few more minutes, so I'll try to take two more questions here. So the next one is, will tax treaties need to be changed if this legislation passes? So again, tax treaties will not change. So I think you need to go and look at how what's in the tax treaty in your country of residence, as well as how non-resident aliens are currently taxed under those tax treaties. So yeah, I hope that helps. Okay, last question. What would re-entering the US look like for people with local tax-free accounts, ISA or the Canadian one that was mentioned? Um, so again, if you re-entered the US, you would be taxed on your worldwide income. Um, so it would be the same as what it would be currently, I believe. Nick, do you want to?
Yeah. So to give a bit more color on this one, this would be very similar to if someone was immigrating to the US as a foreigner. They would also be going through this experience of they have their local accounts that might now suddenly be US taxable. The best piece of advice is whenever you are transitioning in and out of one tax system or another, you should really be looking for some sort of qualified advice. You know, usually it's 1 or 2 hours of the advisor's time to make sure that you're getting all of these steps right. Um, it could be that you need to make sure there's no PFIX in the account. It could be that you need to sell off or otherwise do something with the accounts. Um, this is a complicated individual question, and people do just need to be aware that moving back to the US would be a big tax move, and you would need advising just like all your friends and colleagues would if they moved to the US.
Okay. Well, with that, I think that's a good one to end on here. So I want to thank everybody for joining us. Thank you for your questions. These were really great questions. Please do submit your feedback. So there's sorry, there's two feedback forms. There's the webinar feedback form, and then there's also the bill feedback form. And we would like your feedback on both fronts. So you'll get emailed the feedback forms and everything, but the list of links that was in the chat box, that will also be emailed to you as a follow-up with the recording and the slides. Please do submit your questions through the appropriate feedback forms, and I hope this was informational and helpful. Again, this is not tax advice. This is all very, up in the air, but this is all very exciting development. I think that's the bottom line that I think everybody should take away, and we need more people to get involved in order to make this become reality. So, please do, help us out. So thank you again, everybody. I really appreciate your time. Have a good, morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. Thanks again.